Introduction. Dear visitors, the village you are about to explore is a very special one. The envisioners and creators of the Göcsej will take you back in time by about 100 or 150 years and land you in a make-believe village set up next to one of the stagnant backwaters of the river Zala. These buildings originally stood in separate settlements dispersed all over the hilly region of Zala County known as Göcsej. The idea behind dismantling and then reassembling these buildings to form a fictitious village was to enable us, people born several decades later, to imagine life in a 19th century little village. Because of its isolation and lack of good roads, this area has managed to preserve the archaic features of our material and spiritual culture much longer than elsewhere. The buildings you see have been constructed of beams cut to measure using axes and hatches. Their roofs were thatched with twisted shades of rye grass, held in place using the same material. Even in the old days, when most of Göcsej was still woodlands, timber was a very precious commodity, and when the inhabitants had to move away, or had to divide up their inheritance, or if a building got damaged, they simply removed the plaster covering from the beams, dismantled the walls, and reassembled them in a different location. This skonzen was constructed in much the same way. The buildings purchased in different villages were dismantled in the original location so that they can reassembled and refurnished here. The blacksmith's workshop of Hotto. Constructed of mud rather than timber, which was the building material commonly used here, the blacksmith's shop was erected at the periphery of the village, some distance away from their other buildings. The explanation for this lied in the fire-hazardous nature of the blacksmith's work, as the ember in the open furnace was kept alive all day long, fanned by a pair of bellows in order to keep the wrought iron malleable. With the sparks flying about constantly, there was considerable danger of setting the entire village on fire, and so a screen made of bricks was built above the fire zone against the sparks, and the tall chimney was raised above the roof. The horseshoe hung up above the workshop's door, the symbol of the guild, indicated the primary job of the blacksmith, the fitting of horseshoes. In front of a shed, supported by oak beams, there were 3-legged stools used by the blacksmiths fitting the horseshoes. Usually there was quite a mess here, as all the equipment still waiting to be fixed were left lying about, including the coach parts to be fitted with iron and the raw material to be used. The trade of blacksmith is one of the most ancient professions in the history of mankind. Along with the workshop and the tools, it passed from father to son, from grandfather to grandson. In popular folklore, magic powers and the ability to heal animals as well as people were attributed to blacksmiths. The Hungarian words hályogkovács and csontkovács, cataract blacksmith and bone blacksmith, are reminders of these old beliefs. The blacksmith's workshop played a major role in the life of the village. This was where the travelers exchanged news about the world at large, and also where the locals discussed the ordinary problems of the village. The master blacksmith was among the most respected members of the community. The watermill of György. When he has water, he drinks wine. The saying about the miller goes. And indeed, millers had their work scheduled differently from other people. When there was little rain and a poor harvest, they were often left without work for long stretches. But when the water level was high, and there was plenty of stuff to be ground, they never came off duty. Sleeping in the mill building, millers were woken not by the loud noise, but by the sudden silence, the absence of the monotonous noise made by the machinery, which indicated some malfunctioning. A suitable site for a mill, where the conditions for damming the stream were optimal, was a great intrinsic value, and rarely went unexploited, as it provided a good living to both the owner and the tenant. Besides their own trade, millers were expected to be proficient in many other crafts, such as carpentry or stone carving, because in the old days they quite often built and fitted out the mills themselves, and nearly always repaired them. In addition, the regular upkeep of the millstones also befell on them. It was not uncommon that they were engaged to build bridges or scaffoldings. The millers and the mill tenants were the first entrepreneurs and innovators in our past. Their services were also frequently required as advisors and spokesmen in legal disputes. The watermill is the only building in the Skansen which stands in its original location. The bottom part of its wheel was powered by one of the branches of the river Zola. Its last owner, Göcsej, added a brick section to the original log cabin, built in the 18th century. The furnishing inside was also renovated in the early 20th century, when the introduction of a refiner and sieves of various fineness meant that flour of different quality could be produced rather than the earlier, peasant version, which was produced in a single run and also included the bran. Made of wood, most of the equipment is still functional, but sadly the water has been diverted away from the wheel as a consequence of the regulation of the Zola. Opposite to the entrance, there is the elevator fitted with walls, which was used to convey the grain from the top-up feeder to the main feeder, through which it finally reached the millstones. After the various phases of grinding and sorting, the flour was filled into sacks and loaded through the swinging door upstairs onto the coach standing in the shed. Wooden bell towers. On the square by the watermill, we find the bell tower, or bell stand, in the vernacular. The smaller nobility of Göcsej kept to the Protestant faith, even after the Counter-Reformation. Right until the end of the 18th century, they were not allowed to build churches, and even after Joseph II had issued the Charter of Religious Toleration, they could only have praying house without a tower and a bell. Eventually, these small villages were permitted to build, through royal permission, wooden structures for their bells, provided they employed the same materials and the same building technology that they were using to build their own dwellings. There were several types of bell stands, two of which are displayed at the two ends of our museum street. The most complicated structure stood on a footing made of beams capped by a larger and a smaller roof covered with wooden ties. The first, popularly known as the skirt, sheltered the structure itself, while the later, called the helmet, served to protect the bell from the ravages of the weather. Erected in 1888, the skirted bell tower stood in Budafok, and the simpler, Y-shaped construction had been brought to its present location from Alsó-Csöde. Today's readers can hardly appreciate the importance that bells once played in the lives of the village population. In addition to the position of the sun, it was the sound of bells that marked the passage of time for them, and as for Catholics in specific, the sound of the Angelus Dei brought them brief relief from the work 3 times a day. But the bells could frequently be the bearers of bad news. The knell was tolled to report a death in the parish, or to signal the start of a funeral. The church bells were rung to signal some catastrophe, fire, flood, sleet, or during wartime the approach of the enemy. Sometimes they brought good news, the start of christening or wedding ceremony, or most frequently the beginning of the Sunday Mass. The marked respect these highly valuable objects enjoyed was evidenced in the fact that at times of great calamities, or in preparation for the relocation of the village, it was always the bell that was secured first. Numerous legends have survived about the hiding of bells in marshland or under the ground, as well as about their subsequent discovery, or even the warning sound these lost bells occasionally made. The house from Kálótfa. Rather than standing in isolation within the owner's land, the buildings in the Skansen, similarly to the houses in normal villages, were surrounded by barns and various other outbuildings to form a unit known as the porta. Additional properties of a traditional peasant holding included the ploughland, the meadow, the pasture, and also a piece of forest, which together provided sustenance and self-subsistence for the family. The first porta in the street features the former dwelling of a well-to-do proprietor from Káloczva. In the 19th century, one rarely saw homes with several rooms, as most of the work was done either in the outbuildings or in the open air. One architectural characteristic of the Göcsej villages was that the doors of all the rooms opened to the yard, with no direct access from the room to the next. The windows opened either to the street or to the front garden, where, in addition to the multitude of flowers, one could also see herbal plants, and even some rare varieties of vegetables. Inside the room, in the most prominent spot opposite to the door, a painted cupboard made of pine wood, and a bed featuring floral ornamentation and marked with the year 1848, testify for the former owner's affluence, as any painted furniture, and especially cupboards made by carpenters in this region, still counted as rarities in those days. A stove fed from the kitchen provided warmth for the room. One of the most important spots in the room is taken up by a loom, which stayed here only in the winter. During that time, the bed was dismantled and kept in the storeroom, together with the ornate bedding. Where there was no agricultural work to be done, women turned to the production of various types of domestic textiles. Sitting around the table, close to the loom, the rest of the family spent the long winter nights by drinking wine and telling stories. Next to the bedroom door, and also looking to the yard, there is the entry to the kitchen, the territory of the womenfolk. Made of burnt clay, the oven was only fired up for baking, while cooking was done in clay pots placed on three-legged stools over the ember. The stove for the room was also heated from here, while the smoke escaped either through the gaps between the wooden ceiling to the loft or through the open door to the yard. In the back corner of the kitchen, a warm place was made for a brooding hen, or the chickens, or perhaps a piglet. The third room was the storeroom, where the family valuables, the food reserves, and tools were held. An interesting feature of this particular house was that it even had a second storeroom. Also looking onto the street and opening from the yard, this room stored the excess furniture as well as food and clothing items. Behind the storeroom was the stable. In those days, there were still no strict rules to prescribe the minimum separation between animals and human dwellings, and since the animal stock was the most valuable property in a peasant household, people kept them close so that they can look after them continuously. The same purpose was aided by the déco, a bed weaved from ropes of straw, which allowed the owner or one of his sons to sleep in the stable so as to keep an eye on the animals. In the backyard we find the luku, a large wooden mortar used for breaking and peeling. Originally placed next to the wall of a neighboring shed, it was moved to its current location when the pen for the animals was constructed. The draw well stood at the center of the yard, along with the drinking trough. This design was popular not only in the Great Hungarian Plain, but almost everywhere where the water level was relatively close to the surface, so that it could be reached using such a simple device. The house from Kávás. The main building of the second peasant holding arrived at the Skanzen from Kávás after some vicissitudes of fortune. The first of the purchased building, it was reassembled on an earlier designated location in a meadow near the Calvary. However, on a winter night it had been nearly completely burned down. Reconstructed from the surveyor's drawing using the remnants of the original, it was moved to the street of the New Skanzen. The smallest of all the buildings on display, it has a three-part structure that wouldn't look out of a place in a medieval village. It consists of a room, a kitchen, and a storeroom. Piled high on the ornate bed along the wall opposite to the door, the white embroidered laced bedclothes formed part of the landlady's trousseau. The bed actually used for sleeping stood closer to the stove, where it is warmer. The cradle was placed next to it. For storage place there was a cupboard with 3 drawers. Evidently of a later design, it was placed in a highly prominent place between the 2 windows, along with an older chest bearing the name Rosalia Baksha in the date 1860. The corner, closer to the street, formed another important part of the room. The male members of the family, along with the guests, took their meals here, sitting on the benches surrounding the table. 100 years ago, village folks usually turned it as soon as darkness had set in. The reason behind this was not just that they were exhausted after a full day's work, but also that they knew that the next morning they would have to get up very early. Any late-night activity would have required lighting, and a candle, oil, or petroleum was expensive, while the cheaper domestically produced methods were rather cumbersome. Some places needed more light than the others. The fokla, a splinter of resinous pine, spread a little light in the smoke-filled kitchen, while the main room was illuminated by an oil lamp, popularly known as the pipich, or a candle. If ever there was a need to light any of the other places, portable lamps were used, hung from a nail in the beam if necessary. Electrification only reached the villages of Zola in the 1960s. After airing out the kitchen, the oven kept warm for quite some time. For this reason, various materials were placed on its broad, flat-top surface for drying: fokla, kindling, and hemp, as well as baskets on pumpkin seed, fruit, and leaven. With this particular holding, the stable had several compartments and stood separately from the main building. Today it shelters the Skansen's 4-legged inhabitants. The yard has a carving chair, siószék, which the masters of earlier times used as a vise for carving the handles of tools. Another item of interest at this holding is the Palinka distillery, a heptagonal hut, the walls of which clearly reveal that it was put together using some leftover beams, as well as ones rescued from the burned-down building. Fruits used to play a very important role in the old lifestyle of the peasantry. Garden trees were hardly ever planted around the house or in the vineyard. Instead, the popular varieties were various fruit trees, walnut and chestnut. In addition, most of the holdings also included a separate fruit garden. All which was not consumed fresh was either dried or used in some other way, mostly for brandy distillation. The most popular fruits for distillation were plum, pear, and peach, but in fact almost any fruits would do. Palinka was much needed around the house, also either as a beverage providing energy and warmth. Most of work took place in the open air, under inhospitable weather conditions, or as a disinfectant. It never went bad, and was a worthy candidate for long-distance trading, and also it could be exchanged for salt or any other similarly valuable commodities. It is therefore hardly surprising that almost all the villages in Göcsej had a Palinka distillery. This particular hut, transplanted here from Chud, comes complete with the original cauldron made of hammered copper sheet. The Longhouse of Zolalöv. The third holding is organized around the Longhouse of Zolalöv. 2 rooms, a smoke kitchen, and the storeroom, as well as a machine shed, the pens and the stable are all sheltered by the same elongated roof, hence the name of the building. The design best suited the lifestyle of a large 19th century family of poor peasants. In the first room, looking to the street, lived the young master, together with his wife and children, while the back room was occupied by the elderly parents. This house features the original stoves made by the local stove builder. Both stoves were managed from the kitchen. After sunset, the rooms were illuminated by petroleum lamps, which continued to serve as the most modern form of lighting right in the region, right until electricity was brought here in the 1960s. Some of the clothes were hung up on a rod above the bed. Such rods continued to serve as a traditional piece of peasants' furniture until cupboards gained broad popularity. In the kitchen, the unused vessels were placed on the top of the oven upside down so as to protect it from the soot and the dust. This was necessary because when the oven was fired up, the sooty smoke escaping from it often got trapped in the upper third of the kitchen space, forcing people working near the oven to move around in a bent position. Baking was done in clay vessels fitted with feet, hence the name lábas, meaning with feet, placed on the patka, meaning small bench, the ridge along the perimeter of the oven. As for cooking, the women used thin-walled vessels with metal legs placed over the ember. The burning piece of wood by one side of the container heated the boiling liquid inside asymmetrically, thus causing it to rotate on its own. The large vessels made of clay were enclosed in a wire mesh, so that even if the vessels got fractured by too much heat, it wouldn't fall apart as a consequence and the food wouldn't go wasted. The warm corner in the back was where the goose or the brooding hen was kept under a screen called kotrúc. Large pieces of bread baked 1 week in advance were stored in a well-ventilated bread bins inside the storeroom. In the back of the longhouse there is an outdoor oven where the bread was baked once a week, especially during the summer when there was no need to heat the kitchen, or during preparations for the festivities, or on the occasions of pig slaughter, when large quantities of food were prepared in the oven, bakery, pasta, and roast joint. Behind the outdoor oven there is a wooden enclosure for beekeeping. Woven from twigs, tendrils, or straw and coated with clay, the beehives are arranged on several shelves. You could find many similar bee farms in the back of fruit gardens or among acacias. Beekeeping was a popular activity among men, with honey remaining almost the sole sweetener right until the last third of the 19th century, when the production of sugar beets gained grounds. In the middle of the yard stood the bodonkút, a well made from a single log, hollowed out using controlled fire. Such wells could mainly be found on flat land and pastures, where the water table could be reached using the gomo, an iron hook fitted to a long handle. The small hut behind the well was used for chopping wood. In its original location, Bagód-Vitenyéd, it was called favágító, a simple construction basically designed to provide shelter for the chopped wood and the person doing the chopping. The curved house of Zalaev. The last property in our village street, popularly known as the curved house, has an L-shaped ground plan. It looks different from the other buildings, both from the outside and the inside. This is explained partly by the fact that the building reached its current form, that is, its final form before the relocation, through a series of extensions, and partly by the point that its reconstructed furniture already reflects 20th century conditions. Originally consisting of a single smoke-filled room and a storeroom, the building received a perpendicular extension for another storeroom and stable, to which a further room was added later, facing the street. The unplastered walls inside the building show clear signs of the extension work. The earlier smoke-filled room received a stove complex, complete with a chimney and a horse-shaped spare fireplace. Thanks to the addition of the chimney, the air in the kitchen became cleaner, permitting the storage and use of various kitchen vessels and textiles. The former storeroom was converted in a smoke-free back room, with its furniture arranged in a way already characteristic of the 20th century, organized along parallel lines rather than rectangular. The bed and the table are complemented with a wardrobe and a chest of drawers. This building provides space for our museum activities for school children. At the end of the plot there is a huge T-shaped outbuilding. Its front wall is made of plastered wickerwork, while oak beams were used to construct the back walls. It originally had a wickerwork gate set in a timber frame. By the entrance to the yard, there is a small food storage chamber from Szent Erzsébet-hegy. It has framework structure which is different from the ones seen so far. Similarly to the outbuilding, the beam frame is walled in with plastered wickerwork. Originally, it also had a cellar for the storage of wine and potato, with the attic used for holding maize. The wooden church of Zalacsép. The wooden church, built in 2003, is one of the Skansen's most recent additions of sacred architecture. In the 18th century, there were numerous small churches in Zalakanti, which, similarly to most of the buildings in the villages, were constructed either of logs or of walls made of plastered wickerwork. Many of them perished in fire, and the rest were demolished to be replaced by today's churches made of brick. The last surviving wooden church was in Zalacsép, which we were able to reconstruct using drawings and descriptions published in the contemporary newspapers. Built in the size of a larger dwelling home, the church with a thatched roof had an internal gallery and a sanctuary. On the occasion of major religious events, the priest was preaching from a pulpit set up outside the church, so that those members of the congregation who had not been able to get in could also listen to the sermon. The barn from Bárszentmihályfa. On reaching the island through the bridge, known as the Bűrű, across the Zalos backwater, visitors will immediately confront a building constructed of large beams. Barns like these may have once been found not only around the homes, but also near the pastures and the meadows. This particular barn, with 3 compartments from Bárszentmihályfa, is of special interest on account of its hexagonal ground plan. Such a design allowed the owners to cover a relatively large area with the short beams available. It is plainly visible that all those crude beams which would have been unsuitable for building a proper house could be put to good use here, because their incorporation improved the ventilation of the green fodder. The thatched roof on both sides of the barn gate originally reached down to the ground, thus providing shelter for the chopped wood and the tools. The middle of the barn offered a suitable dry place for threshing, as this area experienced a lot of precipitation around August. This barn provided ample space for 3 or 4 men manually threshing the hay. With the practice of manual threshing becoming obsolete, the barn storage function came to the fore. Coaches, sledges, or other larger equipments were held here. The enclosed homestead of Göcsej. The enclosed homestead was a characteristic way of property development in the Göcsej region of the Szeg, the local term for groups of farm buildings situated on the top of the gently rolling hills. Contrary to what the designation suggests, it was not the house that was enclosed, but it was the yard that was surrounded by the circular arrangement of houses and auxiliary buildings under a single roof structure, with the muck wheeled out of the stables and the pens piled up at the center, waiting to be spread out on the agricultural land. Admittedly, soil fertilization in Göcsej had not started before the end of the 19th century. Before that, most of the local economy derived from animal husbandry, as meadows and pastures were in abundance. The idea of the enclosed homestead probably came about in response to the demands of animal husbandry. The square arrangement of the large stable, the pens, and the other outbuildings using for storing fodder was the best way to utilize space within the small internal yard, as well as to have easy access between them. Also, this arrangement meant that if an animal turned loose, it couldn't easily wander off the premise, and that the place was well protected against outsiders. The outbuildings of the Göcsej homestead are reconstructions, based on surviving signs and the owner's descriptions. The house once belonged to a well-off miller whose mill is not far off. This was confirmed by the unusually large size of the rooms. The front room also functioned as an occasional inn-house, where people could buy wine. The guests were seated around 2 tables, and could even spend the night sleeping on the broad benches of the kitchen, if so required. The large size of the kitchen stove and the vessels suggests that food was cooked for many people. These thin-walled, lightweight pots at the same time demonstrate both the efficient skills of the potters of the nearby Göcsej and the excellent quality of fire-resistant clay found there. Up until most recently, the Göcsej region abounded in woods, so the stoves were often fired up, and in earlier times, when matches were still not available and making fire was a difficult task, people kept it going all the time. To keep the fire alive in the room, a large piece of log was thrown on the ember, which was collected in a can in front of the stove. The kitchen trinity of coal rake, pemet, peel, was always kept around the stove, along with the flat piece of wood used to cover the stove door, called tévő, the salt box, and the fork for lifting the pot, locally known as kurugla. These implements were indispensable to cooking and baking. In the autumn and the winter, one particular work phase of hemp processing, weaving, was usually done in the kitchen. To turn this tiresome and tedious job into a pleasant social occasion, people were either singing or telling stories. The storeroom, with its granary chest of exquisite woodwork, provided further proof of the owner's affluence. The right amount of grain was transferred into the bushel by lifting the sliding doors. Lined up along the walls, there were other large containers for storing food put away for winter, including barrels with wooden hoops. A bread bin hung on the wall, while the mortar for grinding millet, a requisite for any household, stood in the corner. Appreciated for their high nourishment value, gruels of all sorts were very popular. To keep invaders away from the food store, the door was fitted with a wooden lock, opened from the outside with a sizable iron key. The living quarters of the house were separated from the outbuildings by a közpitvar, shared yard. There was a door here which led to the back garden and the fruit garden. The buildings forming the 3 wings of the square were connected by a wooden fence with a huge covered gate. The smoky building of Felső-Szent-Erzsébet. The last building visited during our imaginary stroll through the museum, and also the oldest one, is a belated example of a type that had its origins in the medieval times. The dwelling area was still not separated into the smoky kitchen and the room with a stove. The 2 functions were combined into a single, large smoky building, to which later a smaller dwelling room and larger crop storage building were added. This was followed by the shared yard with its door to the other parts of the plot. Then came the stable, which, together with the since then demolished pen, coach shed, and barn, had once formed the other 2 sides of the former enclosed homestead. The entire family lived their daily lives in the single space called the smoky building. The Hungarian word for house, ház, originally described the room. It was here that they slept, ate, and cooked, and also in winter-time kept warm around the permanently fired-up stove. The door itself has an obsolete design. Instead of being split in the middle, it only has a small opening through which the smoke could escape, and the windows, too, were small and unglazed, so that when the cold was extreme, they could be shut using a wooden plate guided by a pair of lath, called tolitú. The furniture was very basic. The chest in which pieces of clothing were kept was not made by a carpenter using a saw and a plane, but by a joiner using an axe and a hatchet. Instead of floral ornamentation, it was decorated with geometrical design. Its maker carved a plate-size indentation in the crib so that the toddler of the family could have a go at eating on his own. The youngest ones must have been twins, as the caring father carved a double cradle from a single tree trunk. The smaller chamber was where the younger generation slept. Beside the couple's bed and the chest, there was just enough room here for the potato sack or the butter churn. When they were cold, they took some amber from the stove in a vessel, which made the temperature in the chamber barely tolerable. By contrast, in the larger chamber, there was room for everything that a household needed. Unused vessels and naturally a large number of tools, as the autarkic lifestyle required that people be able to make everything, fix everything, and be prepared for everything. The granary chest, made of a single tree trunk, could store a large amount of grain, and in wartime could also serve as a hideout. Kastú. In addition to storerooms and outbuildings, there was another type of building for the family to store more food, clothing, and tools, the kastú. Our example, which represents a typical porch one-story kastú built of beams, is a reconstruction with the original standing in Kustánszeg-Paraszán. The ground-level section may have been plastered with clay and lime, similarly to the main buildings, or it may have been built of stone or brick. In the ground floor room, dumped on the floor made of compacted clay, the family usually stored potato, cabbage, beet, and pumpkin. If any space remained, they may have put in tools and clothing too. The bottom level was also where the barrels of wine and vinegar were kept. There were no windows here, so the door was kept open when someone came in. The upper level usually had windows. Grain, fat, grease, smoked food, and dried fruits were stored here, either dumped on the floor or put in boxes and granary chests. If the building also had an attic, it was mostly used for drying hemp. The key of the kastú was usually kept by the master or the mistress of the house. In other words, the eldest and the most respected member of the extended family, who personally supervised the movement of goods in and out. The Cross of András-híd. On most days, the peasants were working on the ploughlands, the meadows, the woods, or in the vineyard, which were separated by a long walk from their homes or the center of their villages. The dirt roads leading there usually went past numerous religious monuments, statues, pictures, and crosses, testifying for the pious faith and spiritual meekness of our ancestors. The majority of those monuments were erected as votive offerings. Many of the people commissioning these offerings left in their wills a certain sum to their church, so as to ensure that their roadside memorial would be properly taken care of after their death. The wooden cross of András-híd, which features an arched cover, painted ornaments, and the representation of Christ's body, all made of tin, is a characteristic example of roadside crosses in this region in the given period. The tiny bells and stars tinkling in the wind are a testimony to the craftsmanship of Old Master and to the wealth of ornamental motifs in the region. Before the tin Christ, people were praying either for a good harvest, or the recovery of good health, or someone's lucky return to home, or indeed for God's saving grace in general. Hillside wine cellars. Wherever the local conditions permitted it, a vineyard was an essential part of peasant estates. Our ancestors rarely drank pure water if they could help it. For Zalakanti smallholders, the practice of going up the mountain was observed with a religious devotion. The word mountain was a euphemism for the vineyard, regardless of the fact that the site was really nothing more than a hill, yet it was admirably suitable for winemaking. Before the outbreak of the great phylloxera plague of the 1890s, Zalakanti had a significant vineyard industry. Every household stocked up on wine at home, and when they were running low, it was time for the master's next visit to the mountain to refill the cask, sheathed in protective wickerwork. From the architectural viewpoint, the vineyard buildings were no different from the village buildings. Usually they were constructed from walls made of wicker and set in wooden frames. The heavy doors of oak were frequently fitted with clever lock mechanism by the owner. Some of them only had one room for both pressing the grape and storing the wine, although the more popular versions consisted of 2 or 3 rooms, allowing for the separation of the 2 tasks. In some cases, a kitchen or an extra room was added in anticipation of longer stays. The items of the furniture were simple, as they were often made by the owner himself. The curiosity of the Zolotárnok press house is a table carved out of natural wood. In the old days, the fence around the press house and the vineyard, the gyepű, was built of wine and was annually renewed at the time of pruning. In the vineyards, the megye was merely marked by a furrow. Both words literally mean boundary. The cellars were equipped with all the tools and instruments necessary for turning the grapes into must and must into wine. Several types of wine presses exist, the most spectacular of them being the one built of man-sized beams. Of the wine presses exhibited in our skansen, the lavishly decorated example from Nemeshetés is marked with the famous year of 1848, while the one from Zolotárnok displays the number 1772, which is also the year when the press house was built. Besides local residents, people from outside the village could also own property on the vineyard hill. A separate institution has been established for handling the communal problems of the vineyard hill, known as the Göcsej or wine community. Its official head was elected and had the power to impose punishments or to discipline offenders. As the stocks in front of the Tárnok cellar suggest, defying the written and unwritten rules of the wine community could have serious consequences. The crushing mill of Dobronc. Leaving behind the wine cellars, and after crossing a small bridge, we arrive at a building with glass walls, which houses the equipment of the crushing mill once servicing the village of Dobronc. The exhibits include a roaster, a grinder, various presses, and a wooden wheel powered by a draft animal. The pumpkin was an important produce of Göcsej at the time, when pumpkin seed oil was a precious commodity. However, the seeds of other plants such as flax, sunflower, and rape were also processed here. The more valuable, more refined oil was used for cooking, while the cruder variety was used in oil lamps for lighting. Firefighting equipment. The same mill house also displays an iconic object of village life, the firefighting equipment, popularly known as the spritzny, spritzer. The houses that had roofs of straw or wooden tiles, but no chimneys, posed a permanent fire hazard, and when fire did break out, it could turn the entire village into a fireball within minutes. Besides the buckets and the grappling hooks that every household was ordered to keep by law, the communal firefighting equipment, stored usually near the church, could offer the locals some protection after the late 19th century. One such instrument, in addition to the old manual fire water pump, was the collapsible ladder, a very handy tool for fighting fire in taller buildings. The gables. Looking back from the little square in front of the mill, we see a collection of ornate wooden pediments used for traditional village buildings. The vertical wooden panels decorated the street end of the attics of buildings mostly covered with thatched clipped gable roof. The pattern sewn into the wooden panels ensured good ventilation, while the painted flowers and religious symbols, the cross, the star, and so on, can testify for people's undying delight in ornamentation and colors. The Cross of Tashkent. And the end of our tour of the Skansen, we say goodbye to our visitors at the roadside cross brought here from the neighboring village, Deskand. Sheltering under small painted tin roofs, the wooden cross features a number of statues carved in wood. These were not made by a local master. Instead, their owners brought them here from the workshops of woodcarvers from remote villages. Every time religious folks embarked on a new task, and also when they completed it, they asked for God's blessing. On leaving behind their villages, they usually stopped to pray for a successful trip and a happy homecoming in front of crosses similar to this one. We wish you the same. Finno-Ugric Ethnographical Park. There has been a nearly 200-year-long academic debate and emotional strife raging in Hungary, with the occasional relaxations always followed by relapses about the origins and ancient history of the Hungarian nation and language. Rather than forming part of the Indo-Germanic family of languages, generally used by all the surrounding nations, the Hungarian language belongs to the Finno-Ugric group, a strikingly different linguistic tradition. Outside Hungary, the latter languages are now spoken only in the northern parts of Eurasia by peoples greatly diminished throughout their stormy histories. Some of these languages are at the verge of extinction. With the help of the furnished houses in the ethnographic park set up next to the Göcsej Skansen, we would like to describe the lifestyle and material culture of these Finno-Ugric peoples. The buildings situated the furthest are the permanent homes of two ob-Ugric nations, the Kanti, Ostyák, and the Mansi, Vogul. Although geographically they live the furthest from us, linguistically they are our closest relatives. Moving to the west, we see the wooden buildings of two peoples with larger populations, the Chermis, Mari, and the Finns. The ob-Ugric peoples, who led a traditional lifestyle of hunting and fishing, came to the verge of extinction in consequence to the oil and mineral interests. The few survivors have moved to larger cities, where they now live in museum villages closely resembling our own Skansen, and make a living by presenting their former lifestyle to the interested public. The group of buildings exhibiting the lifestyle of the Chermis, whose autonomous territories lie along the river Volga, is a reconstruction of an open-air museum set up there too. As for the building and furniture of the Finnish servants' quarters, these represent the conditions at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. The construction of the buildings, as well as the job of furnishing them with original household items and utensils, has been carried out by representatives of our kindred nations. The ethnographical park was opened to the Hungarian public as part of Hungary's millennial celebrations.